Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 4. Congratulations on making it to the last week of this insanely packed summer session. You have the concert report behind you, so this is just a quote regular week coming up, which means 5 modules, the usual assignments, your test 3 at the end. So it'll be the same time frame as it's been. Your this assignment is due by noon on Thursday. Your discussion posts due by the end of the day on Thursday. Your initial discussion post, everything else due by the end of the day on Sunday. And then I will work on the grading, and I will get all of that information turned in. Just an FYI, just don't look at the final grade here in Canvas. Wait until I've posted the final grade through WebAdvisor. So that's, you can look at this. It's pretty close. Probably for 95% of you, it'll be the same grade, but occasionally there are some subtle things that need to get changed. So yeah, so that's that. So power through. I know we've lost a few folks on the way. I have to say, I'm actually surprised that we didn't lose more. This particular version of this class, this 4-week version, does usually lose quite a few people just because of the intensity of the work. But I think that I've tried to set it up enough ahead of time in advance so that by the time we're like get things going, y'all know what you're in for and you're either in or you're not. I'm still dealing with a few issues. I hope that you're reading comments. Because I do comment on every single assignment. Sometimes it's simple. It's just, hey, good job. Other times, though, it's more lengthy, and I'm doing that to try to help you improve your work. Now, this is the last week coming in, so if you haven't read your comments yet, the comments that I've been leaving for you, hopefully you will now. I have run across a few issues of plagiarism, so there's some folks getting some zeros on assignments, including in the concert report. So I do take that seriously, and I will take it seriously through to the end because it is a serious thing for your whole academic and professional career. You should always do honest work and do good work. And so yeah, be mindful of that, but make sure that you're reading those comments so that you know what it is that I'm expecting. So you have 5 modules coming up here at the end, and we've gone through all the history, going all the way back from the foundations, both from Europe and from Africa, and we've followed that thread all the way through, as I mentioned in the last video, that we've started to see everything start to fragment out. We've talked about important people, we've talked about important game changers, we've talked about all sorts of important stuff. So we ended the last one with ska and reggae. We ended in, we were primarily in the 60s, late 70s, and into early 80s. And that's really where we're going to be from here as well. So there's some influences of the 60s still coming in that will be mentioned. We are predominantly, though, in the 70s and early 80s. And that is where we'll stay. Like I mentioned in the last video, my goal is to get us into MTV. We'll pop a little bit later into that, but I'm not really shooting for, hey, here's everything all the way up until today, because it's easier to find. And like I mentioned before, not much has really changed. Which is kind of sad to think about, that not much has changed a lot. And I know, there have been subtle variations. There have been changes in metal. There have been changes in EDM and dance music. But the roots of dance music go back to disco, which I'll talk about. And there's not been a lot of shift. There may be stylistic differences, but there's not a lot else that's changed. So, here's what you're going to cover in this coming up week. You're going to cover chapter 15, which is punk rock and new wave. Then you're going to go funk and disco. So punk rock and new wave are primarily white genres. Funk and disco, well, funk certainly is a black genre. Disco is an interesting one, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the video and how you're going to learn how that changes. You're going to learn about how those lead into hip hop and rap. And I mentioned it a little bit in the last video because of the influences that came out of Jamaican culture. And then you're going to learn about pop and alternative styles, and then alienated rock, and then back to roots rock. So those are the 5 modules you're going to get. Let me just set these up for you, and let's see if I can come in under 30 minutes. I know you would love that. And I'd love it too. It's not like I want to make these long. I just want to make sure that I've set up enough context. So punk rock and new wave. Punk rock really comes out, if you remember, we learned about garage rock. You learned about Louie Louie with the Kingsmen, and even going back into Chuck Berry influences and all of that. So the British invasion happens, and you have all of these youth all over the US and the world, really, that are like, hey, I want to do that. The Beatles changed that game. The idea that you could run down to your local department store or music store and pick up an electric guitar and a drum set and a bass and some amplifiers, and you could get up and running. That was really not so easily doable until the British invasion. It's another one of those things that we can thank the Beatles for, because they had a big influence on that. So a lot of bands started doing that, and some of the bands did pop, and some of the bands did power pop that you learned about, and then some bands we learned about with the glam glitter movement and all of that. But some of the bands started to write about more of the urban life, street life, the grittier sides of life, and there's really no probably better band to sum them up than the Velvet Underground. So you're going to learn about the Velvet Underground. You're also going to learn about the Stooges with Iggy Pop. You're going to learn about the MC5, and you're going to learn about the New York Dolls. And those are bands that created the foundation that punk rock would come out of. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, one little dangerous step that a lot of my students make, maybe that's hyperbole, but is that they will read introductions to chapters or the very beginning of it, and then they'll think like, oh, that's a summation of it. So a perfect example of that comes up here. When I ask for students in the past, I've had assignments where I'll ask about the roots of punk rock. And so students they'll glance over the chapter and they'll read about the Velvet Underground and the MC5 and the Stooges, and they'll go, oh, that's the roots of punk rock. No. That's the foundations of punk rock. That isn't actually the start of punk rock. Just like when we talk about the blues and country and the rhythm and blues being the roots of rock and roll, they're not exactly rock and roll, same kind of idea. So Velvet Underground, they start writing about sort of real life, particularly when you have songs like Heroin, about heroin. And it comes out the same time, that the Beatles are putting out Yesterday and Eleanor Rigby and all that stuff. And so that starts to influence this new music. Then you add the DIY, the do-it-yourself component of garage rock, and that's really what punk rock comes out of. And punk rock really started out of those scenes, and there was an important club in New York called CBGB's. And CBGB's was an amazing club. It was a biker, wino, Hell's Angel bar. Hookers hung out there, and some local musicians talked to the guy, Hilly, who owned the place, and said, hey, can we start doing some music here? Because at the same time that this is going on, disco is becoming really big, or is really big, in New York. And so you have to understand that these things are all happening at the same time, right? So you have the disco scene exploding in all around the country and around the world, particularly with a club called Studio 54. So there was not a lot of live music happening, very similar to what we have now. And so CBGB starts playing, these bands start playing, but they have the freedom to explore and to develop musically. And so out of this scene, you have really the foundations of punk rock with the Ramones, and the New York Dolls were there, and Patti Smith, and the band Television, and then also New Wave, because Blondie played there, Talking Heads played there, and they formed and started their whole scene there. So out of that, you're going to learn about punk rock and how Malcolm McLaren, who was a businessman and a fashion designer, saw what was happening in CBGB, saw the fashions that were coming out of this, the looks that the Ramones had, the looks that Richard Hell and Television had, and Richard Hell and the Voidoids, and he started imitating that. He goes back to London, and through his shop, he helps create a band called the Sex Pistols, which takes the anger and energy of what was going on in England at the time takes the fashion influences that he saw, and that's really where the British punk rock scene developed. So the British punk rock scene with the Sex Pistols, which was huge, was very much influenced by American music. Then the Sex Pistols tour here for a little bit. The Sex Pistols were only around for a couple of years, 76 to 78. And but they influenced a lot of bands. Everywhere they played, bands would start out both in England and here. There were other bands like The Damned, The Clash, a lot of bands that would start, and then when they started playing here, and then these punk rock scenes would open up across the country. And so in San Francisco, you had bands like Crime and the Avengers, and then the Dead Kennedys. Down here in Southern California, you had bands like the Germs and X. And they developed, and then out of that came the Orange County punk rock scene. And then there was also a new wave scene. And new wave was different than punk. So some people basically say, oh, well, new wave was watered down punk. I'm recording this in my studio, and I'm noticing that the sun is hitting an interesting line, and it's creating these lines across my face. I don't know if they're distracting to you, but I'm just going to roll with it because it's kind of cool and, arty looking or whatever, but it's just my shades in my window that are looking out and to the neighbor's house and all that. So anyways, so the new wave scene comes out. It's very different than punk. Punk has a lot of anger. It has a lot of energy, a lot of aggression. Certainly by the time we get to the hardcore punk bands like Circle Jerks and Black Flag. And then new wave is more melodic. It's more slick production. And there was a British, what became new wave that came out of the pub rock scene with like Elvis Costello. And then here in the States, really new wave as we know it, a lot of synthesizers, a lot of electronic music influenced by German bands like Kraftwerk too. But really the band that started the new wave scene and sound was Devo, that came out of Ohio. And so if you know the song Whip It, that's the band. They actually started a few years before that song became a hit. So you'll learn about Devo and the whole new wave sound. At the same time, so as I would say really, at the same time, disco is becoming popular. Disco is a dance style of music that was influenced by a number of styles. I mentioned the German bands and the krautrock scene that came out, but it was also influenced out of the black scene, particularly out of funk. Now, funk is a dance style of music, black style of music. So if you think about going back to rhythm and blues, then we get into soul and Motown, and then we get into funk. And funk was really started by James Brown. So he's another one of those artists that shows up in a couple of chapters. He's one of the few. You got Bob Dylan, you got Jimi Hendrix, you got James Brown. And so James Brown in the mid-60s moves from being an R&B artist to creating this thing called funk, which was very influenced by African music and the way that African music is put together. It is, if you think of songs like Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, and you listen to the playlist, and you can very distinctly hear a bass part and a drum part and a guitar part, and they lock together as opposed to being, they're all separate lines that lock in together as opposed to just reinforcing each other. So listen for that. James Brown starts funk. Then Sly and the Family Stone comes along. Then you get Parliament Funkadelic, George Clinton. Any of you Red Hot Chili Peppers fans, I know some of your concert reports, every year I get a good chunk of people that do that. George Clinton, who was part of Parliament Funkadelic, produced Freaky Styley. So he really brought in and out that funk sound of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Then out of that comes disco, and it becomes very popular. Now the thing about funk is that funk was primarily a black style of music that really stayed largely within the black community and black audiences. Disco became huge. And there's an interview that I used to show in the class, the Face-to-Face with Gloria Gaynor, and she basically talks about disco, and she says that it's watered down black music so that white people could dance to it, which she is right. And if you listen to dance music, EDM, whatever, and you get that, what we call the 4 on the floor beat, where you have that boom, 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 the kick drum on every beat, that comes out of disco. That's really where that started. The hi-hat sound, the way that stuff came together. And disco was, funk music sometimes would have social message, social meaning to it. Disco was really about sort of the pleasure side of things. And to quote Casey and the Sunshine Band in one of the big disco hits, it was really about doing a little dance, making a little love, get down tonight. It was very popular, particularly in the gay clubs out of New York, and then it really exploded and became popular worldwide. And there were people that hated it too because it was very machine-like. It replaced a lot of live musicians. You used to go out to clubs prior to the explosion of disco and you would have bands playing. But what happened when disco took over was that DJs became more popular than bands, put a lot of musicians out of work, was cheaper for the clubs. They could spin records the whole time. They could get people dancing, which would then get them tired and thirsty, and they would go to the bar more often to get drinks. They didn't have to take breaks. So that became very popular. Some people didn't like that. The movie Saturday Night Fever with John Travolta, of course, really hit at the peak of that and even pushed it farther with that soundtrack with music of the Bee Gees. So you're going to learn about that. Out of that scene in the late 70s, specifically in New York, you have the rap music came out. Now, I say rap music because hip hop, and I think I alluded to this in the last video, but hip hop really was a cultural term. So there was a hip hop culture that came out of New York, the Bronx to begin with, and then it expanded outward. That was made up of a number of components. So it was made up of rap music. It was made up of a particular style of fashion. It was made up of tagging, and it was composed of break dancing as well. So all of those aspects became hip hop culture. Then later, hip hop kind of spun off to become more of a musical genre term. So you're going to learn about the beginning of hip hop and rap. And that came out of, so you had breakdancing competitions, sort of the 70s version of the doo-wop sing-offs from the 50s. And so these breakdancing competitions, they would have people that would bring music, usually with boom boxes, and they would have their songs that they would dance to. It would often be disco songs, but it could also be other dance songs, funk songs, and sometimes even hard rock songs or whatever. And then that went into DJs, and DJs started playing music and, started playing, and they would play the house parties. And then out of that evolved rapping, which comes from Jamaican, what we call toasting, which was a style of spoken patter that took place over songs in Jamaica. And one of the first important artists in terms of rap history was a Jamaican DJ by the name of DJ Kool Herc. And he brought this, and that's really where rap comes out of. So you're going to learn about the roots of rap early on. Out of that, you have Curtis Blow, and you have Afrika Bambaataa, and you have Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, and then of course you have the Sugar Hill Gang with Rapper's Delight. So you're going to learn about where that all comes from, how that leads from the 70s into the 80s. 80s, things change a lot, and something I'm going to talk about in a second here, which is MTV. MTV, August 1st, 1981, huge game changer. Changes the whole landscape of popular music. Eventually started off here and then eventually became global. And MTV played an important role in the popularization of rap, particularly through the Beastie Boys. But you'll learn about Run DMC and the Beastie Boys and other stuff as well, and I have this in the module. You're going to learn about pop music. So pop just means what's popular, right? So pop music has always been around. Pop didn't start at a particular time because pop just means what's popular. In terms of what we think of as popular music, you could certainly go back to Frank Sinatra was pop in the 40s and the 50s. You could go to the swing bands before that and Glenn Miller. But if you go up through into the 50s, there was a lot of pop, and then what we call bubblegum pop, and what you learned about, which was teen idol pop. So pop is followed all the way through the 60s into the 70s. And while there are subtle changes, remember pop music is really about selling records and making money. So it may not have the most artistic integrity, but that's not what it's about, right? It's got other reasons it's made. The analogy that I love to use is a McDonald's hamburger. McDonald's has sold more hamburgers than any other company in the world or restaurant in the world, that doesn't necessarily make them good, right? They're not maybe the best hamburger you've ever had, but they appeal to a large audience in a very significant way. So pop in the 80s was important, but really catapulted as a result of MTV. So again, 1981, August 1st, MTV comes on the scene. There were some artists out that already existed and were already popular. A couple that the book mentions would be Prince, who was out and had records and was somewhat successful, and Michael Jackson, who we've already learned about from the Motown section because of the Jackson 5. He was already popular. His first solo album, Off the Wall, came out in 1979. I think I have that one on vinyl, and I have Thriller on vinyl. I should have thought ahead and actually pulled that out because I bought it when it came out. So he was already popular, but then MTV comes out, catapults them into fame. And as a result, Prince puts out Thriller. Michael Jackson puts out Thriller in 1982, 83, becomes huge, right? It becomes massive, changes the game of music videos. Michael Jackson and Peter Gabriel, by the way, probably two of the biggest influences on moving a music video from a promotional tool into an art form. Back to Prince, started to become bigger, but then Purple Rain comes out in 1984, and that becomes huge. See, I should have planned ahead. I've got that on vinyl as well. In fact, I have Purple Rain on purple vinyl, which was a big deal when it came out back in the day. I bought that when it came out, and I saw Prince on that tour, and I saw Michael Jackson live as well. They're actually two of my favorites. Anyways, I digress. So then you have other artists who became popular because of MTV and weren't even around. So Madonna, who wasn't necessarily the most talented artist in the world, but she had the look, she knew how to dance, she had a built-in audience, she was perfect. And then MTV already existed when Madonna came on the scene, so they worked together to catapult that. So you will learn about that, and then you will learn about New Romanticism, which is a style sometimes called Blitz music that came out of England in the early 80s, really late 70s, early 80s. There's a lot of stuff that came out of England. You'll learn later about goth and industrial and all of that. But so bands like Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, Culture Club came out of a particular scene that developed called New Romanticism that was as much, if not more, about the fashion, and it was perfect timing with MTV to pick up on that. And then you're going to learn about the hair bands. So hair bands are basically what happens with hard rock and heavy metal when fashion becomes more of a thing again as well. And so they were called hair bands because they would use Aquanet and spray their hair up really big. So you'll learn about, the book mentions Poison. Really one of the first hair bands, if you will, that came on the scene was Motley Crue. But you'll learn about some of the hair bands, and then you'll learn about alternative rock. So rock, and pop is going in all these different areas. And alternative rock was rock that it didn't really fit a thing. Some of it was kind of came out of the new wave world, but it had an edge to it. It had a different sound to it. Nobody really knew quite how to categorize it. And with alternative rock, you have the Smiths, U2, REM, some who really even were made more popular. I guess ultimately all of them, maybe not as much the Smiths, but were made more popular because of MTV. So that's chapter 18. Then the last chapter that you're going to have is Alienated and Back to Roots Rock. So Alienated Roots rock is basically anti-establishment, anti-pop, whatever. So you're going to learn about Gothic rock. With Bauhaus and The Cure kind of came out of that thing. You're going to learn about post-punk. So you're going to learn about Husker Du, one of my favorite bands. You're going to learn about Ian MacKaye, and he was from Minor Threat, and then started the emo thing. You're going to learn also about the Replacements out of Minneapolis. So Husker Du and the Replacements are both out of Minneapolis, which is the same town that Prince is out of. And then you're going to learn about industrial rock. and industrial rock. Going back, I'll give some videos, some early stuff with Front 242, Skinny Puppy, a German band called Einstürzende Neubauten, which is, they're amazing. So someone did their concert report, I can't remember who off the top of my head, on Rammstein. So Rammstein was kind of influenced by some of these bands as well. And then through Ministry, and then that leads to Nine Inch Nails, if you know Nine Inch Nails. You're gonna learn about speed metal and thrash, and I'm flying through these because I'm trying to come in under 30 minutes, but we're getting close. So speed metal and thrash metal. So the big three with speed metal, of course, are Megadeth, Metallica, and Slayer. Thrash metal, you get Anthrax, and then there's death metal with Cancer and Venom. And then you're going to get back to the roots rock. And this is where I like to wrap the class up with Bruce Springsteen. You can see his autobiography there behind me. Bruce Springsteen is considered by a lot of rock critics one of the two band/artists that really kind of saved rock and roll. The other being the Ramones. The Ramones that took it back to 3-chord, power chord, very influenced by 50s pop chord progressions. But Springsteen really went back to the heart of rock and roll. He was influenced by the rock and roll of Chuck Berry. He was influenced very much by the music of the Beach Boys, particularly in production. He was influenced very much by the soul bands of the 60s, folks like Wilson Pickett and Otis Redding. And he put together a band called the E Street Band, and they were and are about playing live and about singing songs about, sort of the common man and working class folks. And so Springsteen to me is always where I try to end it, because of it really makes this class come full circle in a lot of ways. And hopefully out of this class, you've seen that, there's a zillion splinters and threads that you can follow through, but there's so much commonality in all of this music. Hopefully through the course of this class, you have discovered some new artists. Hopefully you have made some connections. Hopefully you are coming out with an appreciation of the stuff that your parents and your grandparents liked. And hopefully you've come out of the class with somebody new that maybe you didn't know about or didn't know much about, that now you've added into the playlist. I always say that my goal with this class is not to have you not like the artists that you like, but to just add to the playlist. I mean, that's the beauty of it. We all have our guilty pleasures. If you remember back in week 1, you learned about neural nostalgia. You learned about the music, and I know a lot of you are in high school, so you're still here. This music that is forming with you as you grow and develop from 12 to 20. And it's going to be your favorite music for your whole life. But hopefully now through this other music, we're adding to it and we're creating a richer experience. There are a lot of people that will tell me they love, all kinds of music, and rarely do I find somebody that does truly, because the musical world is so diverse. And this class focuses on pop and rock music that really developed here in the United States and then went global. But there's all sorts of amazing world musics that are out there. There's all sorts of amazing classical music that is out there. And I listen to all of it. What you just see, some of my classical CD collection. I've got a ton of rock and pop stuff in the garage. I have a world music selection here. I just kind of eat, sleep, and breathe music, to say nothing of creating it as well. So last video. Hopefully you have a great week. Hopefully you come out of this not just with the idea that it's about trying to get through a class, but it's what you can learn in the class. And I hope more than anything that sticks with you. Those of you in high school, those of you in college, those of you out, that it's about the learning. That is what matters. Okay? I'll leave it with that. Have a great week. Take care.